Chinese. The U.S. Space Force held a ceremony formally activating U.S. Space Force's space at Vandenberg Space Force Base today. U.S. Space Force's space mission is to plan, integrate, conduct, and assess global space operations in order to deliver combat-relevant space efforts.
U.S. Space Force is a reality, and SpaceX's Starship could be their ticket to a USSF maneuver force in space. The burning question is, how will all this take place? How will the new force be organized, equipped, trained, supported? Today, I'm going to draw on my work with the Department of Defense to talk about all that and more. We'll even talk about what we might call the organization soon to be assigned to the USSF. I'm Greg Piquel, and this is Space Defense Tech. Stay tuned. We're about to explore some seriously virgin territory, the birth of the U.S. Space Navy. Before we get too far into this, one burning question needs to be answered. Why? Why a maneuver presence in space? The answer is both simple and compelling. If we don't do it, the Chinese will. And as a growing military power, they understand the importance of space. It's that simple, really, and just as critical. Any terrestrial power that achieves dominance of the orbitals will be in a position to dictate what comes next. And the traditional correlation of forces planet-side won't matter at all. The Chinese have been progressing rapidly in their efforts to compete for the orbitals, to include recently establishing their first space station. More to the point, the Chinese communist leadership must be expansionist in order to retain power. There's a reason why the 6-dash line in the South China Sea exists. The good news is that, almost purely by accident, we are poised to completely outpace the Chinese in space in the near term. That's because a guy named Musk and a company called SpaceX will shortly enable DOD to put forces in space quickly and affordably. The Chinese can always catch up, but for now, the US holds the trump cards. So the nation has certainly been blessed to have Elon Musk to almost single-handedly endow us with leadership in space, but our good fortune doesn't end there. Thanks to the efforts of Representatives Jim Cooper and Mike Rogers, the Space Force was established in law in 2019, and this is a far bigger deal than anyone thought at the time. Up front, it eliminates the inter-service food fight that would surely occur when things got real. And things definitely get real when you put maneuvering starships in orbit. So how did this happen? Let's go to the source. This document from the Office of the President, and dated February 19, 2019, established the United States Space Force, or USSF. Just as importantly, it spelled out what the new organization was supposed to do. That said, the devil is in the details. You see, page 1 of this memo directed that the USSF be placed within the Department of the Air Force, kind of like the way the Marines operate within the Department of the Navy. Believe me, that's a smart move all by itself. Otherwise, you'd have to stand up an entire military department from scratch, and no one really wants to do that. Putting the USSF under the Air Force was a really smart decision. Speaking of smart decisions, whoever was writing this was thinking seriously about the future. Why? The next section, Definitions, specifies that the Space Force will initially be placed under the Air Force. And that word is not there by accident. Someone was thinking strategically. It gets better. Right after the document specifies that the USSF will be placed within the Air Force, it coins a completely new term, the Department of the Space Force. The term Department of the Space Force refers to a future military department within the Department of Defense that will be responsible for organizing, training, and equipping the USSF. Why is this brilliant? Because the Army, Navy, and Air Force are known officially as the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, etc. See how that works? This phrase perfectly tees up the USSF to eventually be its own separate military department, even though the conditions for that event were literally nowhere to be seen when the document was written. See what I mean about brilliant? Finally, a third phrase, immediately following the text about the Department of the Space Force, completes the picture. It specifies the term U.S. Space Command as a unified combatant command. Now, one of the most important military reforms of the past 50 years in DOD divided the globe up into geographic combatant commands with a single general or admiral in charge of each. That eliminated the old Army, Navy, Air Force food fight that used to occur whenever we went anywhere to fight. This third definition lays the groundwork for a combatant command in space. whoever penned this document was a strategic visionary of the First Order and an unsung hero as well. Do you think the Space Force will put manned starships in orbit? Why or why not? Please let me know in the comments section below. And while you're at it, please like and subscribe. There's a lot more to talk about in the future history of the U.S. Space Navy. The next challenge is to figure out what actually needs to happen to put Space Force maneuver assets, starships, in orbit. What are the actual requirements? Because in the world of the Department of Defense, everything starts with a requirement, and the Space Force is no different. As this image lays out, there are 7 space power disciplines needed by U.S. combat forces in orbit. The most important one, orbital warfare, is also probably the most critical, but all the rest are important as well. Some would argue, and I would tend to agree, that the 6 disciplines following orbital warfare are actually contributors to orbital warfare itself, but that's neither here nor there. This list is hugely important because it gives direction and focus to the efforts of the USSF in the months and years ahead. Now this next image shows several key documents driving the Space Force. They're available online and for free, and they're suddenly really interesting reading. Perhaps the biggest takeaway, though, is what they don't talk about: maneuvering starships in space. The good news is that the documents are more than sufficient to cover the development and use of on-orbit maneuvering starships once we do get there. So enough theory already, let's get to the fun stuff. What would a USSF fleet in space actually look like? Well, to start with, this is the current Space Force organization chart. Now, this chart is illustrative for several reasons. First, you'll notice that there's an operation component, but no actual maneuver units. Now, that makes sense, since USSF units at present are centered around satellite operations, cyber activities, missile launch detection, and things like that. On the other hand, this chart goes a long way in illustrating the lesser-known components of the organization, like Space Systems Command, SSC, and Space Training and Readiness Command, or STARCOM. These functions are critical to the foundation we need to actually make Space Force a viable and sustainable actor in space. Now, with that in mind, this next chart shows the potential organization of the 1st Space Wing, the USSF's first true maneuver unit dedicated to space operations. Now, 2 things about this chart are critical. First, you'll note that we have a lot more than just combat spacecraft. We have logistics and personnel variants, all-important refueling tankers, and likely more specialized platforms in the future. The second thing that should jump out are the numbers of ships. Similar to wet water Navy carrier groups, for every ship in orbit, the USSF will need several more conducting training, maintenance, and just plain giving their crews some downtime. Okay, a note on nomenclature. One of the more interesting challenges confronting the Space Force as it prepares to deploy maneuver assets is what to call them. The Space Force leadership has already weighed in on this to a certain extent. They call their tactical units of action squadrons. Up till now, the USSF has used a combination of Air Force nomenclature as well as some homegrown terms. All that said, historically, writers of spacefaring novels have used nautical terms to describe maneuvering platforms in space, like frigates, destroyers, cruisers, and that makes a lot of sense in some ways. So what does the Space Force do? Well, the solution is actually simpler than you might think. The Space Force is a joint organization, at least in its function, so nomenclature can be co-opted from other services as needed. In this case, the naming convention for the Starship, given its relative size and crew complement, would arguably be a Corvette. Other variants could be called tankers or replenishment ships, and this would not only make sense from a real-world perspective, it would also allow for flexibility in naming for future platforms. Cruiser, anyone? So putting ships in space doesn't do much good unless you can man them. In my next video, we'll tackle one of the greatest challenges facing not just the Space Force, but civilian space training needs as well, assuming Elon still wants to go to Mars. Stay tuned for the next episode on the future of the U.S. Space Navy.